going to do today, if you're up for it. I'm going to take you through a very agile agenda. The origin story of the Hope Circuit. So when Anna gave you the brief bio of me, it's a kind of unlikely story. I'm a Shakespearean scholar, trained as an early modernist, really understand my world through the theater, but somehow ended up writing a book about systems change in higher education. So what is that origin story? How did I get here? And why does that illuminate for us different kinds of entry points into higher education at a time of massive paradigm shift? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the 10 conceptual tools that I discovered when I was writing the book. I did not set out to say, I've got 10 conceptual tools and I'm going to apply them to these 10 different aspects of a complex organization. What happened was these conceptual tools emerged, and they emerged in conversation with 300 humans, and then all of this, 300 humans. Ooh, that's really fun.
Yeah, that's better.
So I'm going to share those 10 conceptual tools. Thank you, Nicholas. We're going to go through them and think about, and an invitation for you to think about how you might want to adopt and adapt them in your own context. In your context, your sphere of influence, your sphere of control. What does that look like in the everyday practice? We're then going to talk about building a blueprint. And I think this day is a beautiful day for you all to sit in rumbly spaces, to reflect, to think through, to imagine, to wonder what if. I love that what if, because one of my favorite definitions of hope is from Ira Shore, who says, hope is challenging the actual in the name of the possible, right? Looking clear-eyed and candidly at the world around us, right? Not erasing this moment of deep discomfort and conflict, not sitting in spaces of despair and stagnation, but to look at the world around us and say it is not inevitable. It was created by architects. We are also the architects of a creative future. Dystopian futures, we hear them all the time, right? We see politicians and pundits and birds talking about dystopian futures. That's not inevitable. The future hasn't been written. And yet we have to figure out what the tools are to metabolize this moment in time, which is full of uncertainty, accelerated change, animated by polycrises. What does it mean for us to look at this moment, to take the tools necessary to metabolize it into a mindset? And then for me, most crucially, and this is why I'm so excited to be here, is how do we go from moment to mindset to movement? How do we build social movement? How do we bring folks along with us? How do we invite people in to that co-creative process? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And moving from mindset to movement also gives us an opportunity to dream about the possibilities of paradigm shift. And what I write about in the book, I'm more convinced of now more than ever. The book came out 14 months ago, and I was using language of paradigm shift when I was writing the book. I actually don't think that language is bold enough for the moment that is happening. We are in sector-wide collapse, especially in Canada. And I'd like to spend some time thinking with you and through this concept of the Canadian higher education sector and how beautifully paralleled it is to the Irish higher education sector, and where those possibilities are in those paradigm shifts, what we need to double down on and what we need to release. But in Canada, we are in the midst of a sector-wide collapse, and that collapse for many feels catastrophic, right? It's the end of the continuity of a model that we've been tweaking for about 80 years and we've run out of room. But for others, especially those who the systems were not designed for, that collapse is a relief. Because what you can do is you can plant new seeds for something else to emerge. What we need is the time and the community in order to imagine something different is possible. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and we're going to spend the day reflecting and rumbling. I use that concept of rumble from Brené Brown, who talks about the rumble as an invitation to put something in the middle of the table, to put an idea or a concept there, to say, I am not too sure I am right. I'm going to put this out there and I'm going to hold it lightly. Whether that's your mindset, your perspective, something that you've internalized about the current system, to put it in the middle of the table and say, I'm going to hold my opinions lightly, but my values firmly, and willing to walk out of this room at 3 o'clock this afternoon thinking differently, having an insight, having a light bulb moment, having your brain rewired even in one small aspect so that you have the tools necessary to go back out into the world and to shape a creative future in your own context. So that's the Agile agenda. So from moment to mindset to movement, how do we get there? What does that look like? The origin story of Hope Circuits is like any, I think, good story, messy, non-linear, and very circuitous. So I started writing this book with two of my, I call them my weird sisters. We're Shakespeareans, weird sisters from Macbeth, right? These wonderful, witchy women who have no positional power, no authority. The resources that they have at their disposal are based on the land around them. All of the tools are hiding in plain sight. They manage to build intentional community and use language to dismantle the very centers of militaristic, violent, patriarchal power in Scotland. These weird sisters live on edges and margins, on heaths and on fens, and together can create a moment of collapse and emerge something else at the end of the play. The witches are never resolved at the end of the play. They are still witching out there. And we really love that idea of what it would look like to build those kinds of conversations that were polyvocal, that were joyful. We were Shakespearean scholars, and we had dismembered ourselves. We had taken all of the joy and all of the dirty bits of Shakespeare out to sound very rigorous and very scholarly and write all sorts of articles for our promotion, evaluation, and review. And what happened was we all got full professor, we all understood the system, we all have tenure, and we were deeply sad. Because the thing that called us to the work was the thing that we had dismembered in order to manage within these broken systems where value circulates in rigid, vertical hierarchies. And we got together in 2015, and the one provocation that we had was, what would it look like to write a book that sounded like ourselves? That sounded like our voices and that modeled conversation rather than argumentation. What did it look like to create spaces where you could build and illuminate rather than deconstruct and dismantle? What would it look like if we could write without anticipating all of the refutations and armoring up for that asshole in the conference who looks for your etymology or a footnote, right? That armor, we wanted to disarm. We wanted to break open. We wanted to imagine something else is vivid in that scholarly work. So we wrote this book, and we finished it, and it was joyful. It took us 5 years because we had to unlearn and remember what called us to this work. And then COVID hit. Literally, the manuscript was done, we saw it all, we got it all ready, and COVID closed the doors. COVID closed the doors in Canada on March 13th. Every single one of the 97 publicly funded universities closed on the same day. Theaters were shuttered, and the very world that we knew was radically altered. So all the places I had located hope, the theater, the classroom, and a civil and just society were now up for grabs. What I thought was unassailable and eternal was now absolutely pinned to a moment of groundlessness. So we looked around, and I thought, what do I need to do? What do I need to think through? And who do I need to be in conversation with to metabolize this moment? And really from this was a question that animated everything else that we did. So this notion we had theorized in the book about what hope was and what relationship it had to learning was the platform for me to reach out and to build hope circuits. So we say that learning is embodied hope. It happens in time, it happens in bodies. Each act of learning is unique and can never be reproduced in a factory line. It cannot be abstracted from the bodies and the lives of learners who embody it any more than a verb can function grammatically without an agent. Hope is a verb. And I think that is really important for us. What can we do right now? How do we anchor this in practice? Paulo Freire says to hope alone is to hope in vain. Hope must be anchored in practice. We can do it. We can act on it. We can build it. We can find the ways forward. And yet, as I started, we are sort of estranged from the very concept that can save us, right? I'm not a Pollyanna. But I think that is short-sighted. And I think that we need to rehabilitate this notion of hope as a verb, as action-oriented, as something that is done in time in communities and bodies. I read this a lot when I was writing the book, and it was one of my favorite quotations. People speak of hope as if it is this delicate, ephemeral thing made of whispers and spiders' webs. It's not. Hope has dirt on her face, blood on her knuckles, the grit of the cobblestones in her hair, and just spat out a tooth as she rises for another go. Hope is hard, hope is gritty, hope is badass and unruly and dynamic. But what does it have to do with systems? What does hope have to do when we actually, and when I was writing Hope Circuits, I was imagining this whole group of readers saying, that's all very nice and sweet. You're talking about hope over here, but we're the big boys doing the real work over here. What does this have to do with financial accounts and Excel documents and spreadsheets and strat plans? The whole building is listening. It's gorgeous. But what does it have to do with systems? I think it has a lot to do with systems. James Clear wrote a book called Atomic Habits, where he says you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your system. So we can have lots of hope, but unless we are looking at a systems level and taking a structural approach to it, we will hope in vain. It must be anchored and built into the systems themselves. So as a Shakespearean, everything I needed to learn about systems thinking I learned from Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, and Hamlet is not a play about a university student who drops out because his father dies suddenly and he has to go home, and he walks around angsting in existential ways, smoking a Gulwaz cigarette and wondering about to be or not to be, right? We're very unfair with our reading of Hamlet. We're very dismissive of him. He's the butt of many jokes, but that's not what the play is about. The play, Shakespeare tells us, is that something is rotten in the state of Denmark. It doesn't matter what decision Hamlet makes. It doesn't matter how resilient he is or how many student success retention strategies we place around him. If we do not go to the root of those systems and surface that rot and have a clear and candid acknowledgement that something is rotten, we will just continue to perpetuate tragic cycles over and over. We see Hamlet Sr. and Fortinbras Sr. fight over a piece of land not large enough to bury your dead. And Hamlet, again, that next generation of cycle of violence is inevitable unless we surface the systems, unless we look to the rot and are willing to do something about it. So, one of the things that I started off with this book, I accidentally interviewed 300 people. It was an earnest outreach, one conversation at a time, and it turned into something larger than itself. But what I realized when I interviewed 300 people, I didn't have a plan, have a sort of methodology. I didn't say I've got to do this group and this group and this group. I just reached out to hope warriors, to luminaries, to people who are building and illuminating, and who were really managing these broken systems in beautiful ways. What happened when I was talking to these folks is I recognized that for most of them, creativity and innovation was happening despite, not because of the conditions within which they were working and learning. And that made me sad, that made me howl into the abyss, but that also got me into these restless conversations about what would it look like if we create systems where people are flourishing and tapped into their purpose because of the systems, not despite them. So, Hope Circuits. I have no business reading this book because I'm Shakespearean. It is a neuroscientist reflection. Martin Seligman, father of positive psychology, came out with this book as his memoir. And his memoir says that 40 years ago, he had this concept with his partner, Steve Mayer, about learned helplessness, right? That they would give negative stimuli to animals or humans and even open the door so that they could escape, but they didn't. They just lay down and continued to be hurt and harmed. And so they created an entire field about learned helplessness, which informed K-12 education, government, policy, all sorts of things. Until fast forward 40 years later, Steve Mayer calls Martin Seligman and says, Martin, I think we got it wrong. I've been mapping the brain for 40 years. And what I think I found was not that helplessness is learned, but in fact, helplessness is the default. What is learned is hope. And I think I actually found it in the neuroplasticity of these synapses. And I think I have a picture of this rewiring. With deliberate and intentional action, you can rewire your brain to be more hopeful. And he wrote this book, which was incredible, not as a, oh, I think I was wrong, mea culpa, but as a celebration that he lived long enough in this discipline to be proven wrong. And I read this book, understood about 5 pages, but pulled out this beautiful metaphor. If you can learn hope circuits in brains, which are the most complex systems with that neuroplasticity, surely we could do that in other complex systems. Surely we could build hope circuits in our organizations, in our institutions, our universities, our communities of practice, our associations. So that was really the sort of guiding principle about that. And you can say, oh, that's great. That's a lovely metaphor, but how do we actually do that in these incredibly complex organizations and systems? So that was the question I lived into and learned into with Hope Circuits. What I did was I distilled from this question that I asked 300 people what they would do and how they would do it. What tools did they need? So I would say, what would it look like to build systems that fostered human and ecological flourishing? Right? What would it look like for people? And I use flourishing from the classical Aristotelian notion of a telos, right? That we have this amazing world. We are put on this earth for a purpose, for a telos. And the more deliberately and intentionally you tap into your purpose, your telos over time, the more you flourish, the more you experience something called hegemonia. So that was a question for me. How do we tap into purpose? How do we create the systems where people, and I think higher education in particular, is a place where you can go and find your purpose. You can identify it. You can find the tools to more deliberately and intentionally engage with it. You can get those tools to go out into the world and to make it better, more just, and more humane. Am I cutting out? Yeah? I'm just going to put it right here. It's going to be great. So, distilling from those conversations, what I found, 10 conceptual tools. The first conceptual tool is the one I'm the worst at, which is slow down and pause. So there's this beautiful speech by Bayo Akinmolafe, who did this lecture in the middle of COVID, and he said, the times are urgent, let us slow down. And that totally changed the furniture in my brain, because I understood what it meant for the times to be urgent. You are, right? And what happens when the times are urgent? We speed up. We stay longer. We create ad hoc task forces where good ideas go to die. But slowing down and pausing allows for a second learned response. So going back to Seligman, right? It's not learned helplessness. Helplessness is the default response. Something else is possible. Something else, a second response, can be learned. Slow down and pausing allows you to surface the systems, allows you to see things that otherwise in the busyness of business you wouldn't. I told the story about this beautiful parable that David Foster Wallace. It's okay. David Foster Wallace, American essayist, tells the story of a parable of an old fish swimming by 2 younger fish. And the older fish looks at the 2 younger fish and says, hey boys, how's the water? And the fish keeps swimming, and the younger fish looks at the other fish and says, what the hell is water? And David Foster Wallace says that is in fact the most important thing that we need to do, is to continue to say, this is water, this is water, this is water. That we are immersed in systems that are invisible to us, especially if those systems were designed for us. They are frictionless, they are invisible, they are in our everyday, and yet they are shaping our behaviors, our mindsets, our perspectives. So if we can slow down for long enough and surface the systems, we can start to see how they're shaping our behaviors, our institutional culture, our relationships, and the structures themselves. We can then practice divergent thinking from not going straight at a problem, right, directly at it. I do that all the time, I just run into brick walls all the time. Taking a side step, moving over, using a metaphor, using a different disciplinary lens, borrowing from neuroscience, doing all of those things, cobbling together different pieces can allow us to really engage in a big, wicked problem from a new and creative standpoint. We don't have to commit to unlearning and relearning. All of us in the room have benefited from systems. We have navigated them. We have survived broken systems, which also means we've internalized a lot of things in the systems that are probably not serving us and maybe never served many. So what does it do when we say, I'm committed to unlearning and relearning? I'm committed to surfacing some of those internal conditions. Even as I seek to upend them, sometimes I reproduce them unless I'm critically reflecting on them. So I said a lot in that, and I'm always willing to do that learning and relearning piece, even though it's really hard. Living into the questions, right? We have the worst thing that anyone could ever do to us as academics is tell us we're the smartest people in the room and that we're authorities and experts, because that means we have to have an answer. It means that we have to have a solution to something instead of sitting in the curiosity. And so releasing ourselves from the tyranny of the right answer and instead living into questions. Krista Tippett, who's a wonderful podcast host for On Being, says the quality of the questions that you live into shapes the quality of your life. So what questions we live into makes our reality, creates it. So how do you live into the questions? Don't do it unintentionally, and we can do it deliberately and with intention. Staying with the trouble, sitting in discomfort, sitting and staying in emptiness. Understand that sometimes the lesson is in the pain, not around it. Right? That toxic positivity is something that erases the discomfort of our own transformation, but sitting in the trouble and asking, what can I learn from this at this moment, is one of the most powerful ways forward. Reimagining authority and expertise. We're doing that in Canada through a number of different lenses, but structurally and systemically through responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to commit with our colonial institutions to decolonization and indigenization. To imagine that there are Western knowledges, but they're not the only knowledges, and that we must put different ways of storytelling, of being, a relationship to land and one another together for those collisions and convergences, not to assimilate them, but to see those beautiful connections and sparks between different kinds of knowledges. We sit and take a systems level. Canadian metaphor that I love, so you may or may not get it. But there's a salmon and the dam metaphor. So the salmon and the dam. Anytime I encounter somebody who's grumpy, who is gaslighting, who is slow walking, who is behaving badly, I have to ask myself the question, am I going to blame the salmon or am I going to blame the dam? And by that I mean that we often look at the individual behavior, but we don't look at what the systems are doing to drive those behaviors and mindsets. So if you can go upstream and recognize that somebody in the promotion, evaluation, and review committee who is blocking the review of a junior faculty who's doing creative things, you have to think, okay, what does that look like upstream? How does value circulate within those systems? And how can we reach those folks who are pooling in places that don't serve them and never served many? So what does that do if we can take a systems level approach, not blame the salmon, but look to the dams and dismantle them? I think that has been a really powerful tool for me to exercise critical empathy. Change your language, change the world. We are addicted to the dominant narratives of our time that are built on scarcity and crisis and loss and lack. In 2022, the word of the year from one of the biggest dictionaries was permacrisis. Our little lizard brains light up with dopamine when we doom scroll. We get something out of this lurching from one crisis to the next, from putting out one fire to the next. We work longer, we feel relevant, we feel in our bodies that kind of surge capacity, and yet it is draining us, depleting us, burning us out, and dismembering us. So what does it mean instead to tell other stories? We live in abundance. In the Canadian higher education sector, we live in abundance even as we imagine ourselves in scarcity. We are publicly funded. We have 97 universities, publicly funded, social mission driven. We have enjoyed public trust that has been steady for 150 years, except for the last couple of years where we've seen a decline in trust. That's terrifying. We look south of the border, and I think, you're absolutely right that we can look with smugness and even a sort of glib, oh, that's not us. It's us, it's coming for us, it's already happening. What does it mean to do something differently? What does it mean to understand our sector? And I believe that the Irish national higher education sector is an incredibly powerful one. We look in Canada to the US all the time to what does higher education look like in the US and how can it guide us? I think we need to stop doing that. I think we need to start doubling down on what makes our national sectors unique, powerful, abundant, wired for flourishing, and full of possibility. Love to live into that question with you today. And then finally, that 10th conceptual tool. There's no hierarchy of those tools. I use those tools. Some come in and out of focus in the book. They're more timely and relevant depending on the chapter or the topic. But there is one conceptual tool that is more important than any, and it is building intentional community. And I should probably pluralize that, intentional communities, right? Finding your weird sisters, finding your Kevins, finding those places who are on the edges and margins sometimes of the center, building in spaces where we can imagine something different is possible is a powerful way of going. We have doubled down in many of our national sectors on the dominant paradigm, which is only speeding up its collapse. It's only precipitating the crisis. So what does it mean to imagine something different? We need to build intentional community, which is what you're doing today, which is so magical. All right, this is hard hope work. Systems are designed to be resilient. And by resilient, I mean from the Latin, resilient means to recoil or to snap back to status quo. We use resilience a lot to talk about students and student persistence and retention and success. We develop these as individual capacities that people need to build their resilience, and yet in both systems and in individuals, if we're asking people to be resilient in deteriorating conditions without committing to changing the cause of those deteriorating conditions, we are being unfair. We're in the tragic cycle of Hamlet. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. So how do we understand, first of all, that your exhaustion is a sign that the systems are working, that they're resilient? You're getting caught anytime you try to change a system in the recoiling or the snapping back to status quo. How do we say that out loud? And then how do we build systems where we never have to say the word resilience again? That we can focus on flourishing. We can focus on allowing people to tap into their purpose, to their telos, to experience eudaimonia, to experience that illumination of that purposeful work that is actually, I think, the only way forward. So one of my provocations is pay attention to the next time you use the word resilience. Right? It's code word for a bunch of things. At an institutional level, it's code word. In Canada, resilience in our strat plans is cuts, scarcity, efficiency, but not in a good way. I think teaching and learning is where hope circuits are built. I think teaching and learning creates those spaces, both in form and in content, about how we build those hope circuits. And we get to spend time with young humans. That is one of the greatest gifts, that every single ecosystem that we work in, every single classroom that we get to build and play with, we connect with these little hope warriors, right? That they're challenging the actual in the name of the possible. But what is alarming, and I'm going to just howl into the abyss for 1 second, is that we have noticed in the last couple of years that the 18 to 23-year-old, the emerging adult demographic we've been studying, ever for the last 80 years, are reporting the lowest levels of hope since we've been recording. So the very folks that we look to, that we work for, that we build generative spaces for them to inhabit, are feeling hopeless, helpless, disempowered, experiencing eco-grief, experiencing deep trauma. If that is not a call for us, if that is not the canary in the coal mine, I don't know what is. I want to ask us to a provocation about how to blame the salmon or blame the dam, but also turn that gaze inwards a little bit. I often will identify as the salmon, right? Sturdy, innovative, playful, interested in justice and inclusion, absolutely identify as the salmon, but sometimes I'm the dam, and sometimes I'm the bear. And sometimes it changes, not just from, semester to semester or, project to project. It changes every day, even in a day, depending on the meeting I'm sitting at, whether it's the board or Senate or resource allocation or in the classroom. So I'd like you to think about what happens. Sometimes you're the salmon, sometimes you're the dam, and sometimes you're the bear. How are we complicit in reproducing systems, even as we understand that they are broken? So how do we go from moment to mindset to movement? How do we do that? And I think the reason why I wrote the book, Hope Circuits, was not to be prescriptive, not to tell you everything that is wrong with higher education. We have 1 million books out there about higher education, damning indictments of it, giving us with forensic precision all of the reasons why we can't have nice things. Book that came out that I use as an example, greatest title ever, full of disdain and data, is whatever it is, I'm against it, change, resistance, in higher education, right? Rosenberg came out with that 18 months ago. I read that book and I was like, yeah, I've read this book 100 times. There are no solutions. There is no commitment to building and illuminating and creating. There is indictment without invitation. Did you just give me this? 5 minutes. I know. Thank you. I can do this. And I don't want to write those kinds of books. I think those books are really important. I think we need to look candidly and clear-eyed at the problems. I think that is part of the hope circuit, right? Despair and rage and anger and disorientation all have to be under the umbrella of hope. Hope has to be able to contain those. In fact, Africana professor at Yale, Willie Jennings, says that anger is the engine of hope now. He was writing that in 2022, that we can harness. We should be absolutely indignant. We should have righteous indignation at the systemic dismantling of human rights that we see across the world. That actually is also hope, because it's challenging the actual in the name of the possible. Our understanding of hope has to be broad enough, wide enough, and expansive enough to have all of those concepts, as well as the joy, the pleasure, the delight, and the flourishing. So I had to write 3 books. I'm almost done Hope Circuits 2.0 and 3.0. So I guess that's 4 books before I recognized one very simple and elegant thing that you probably all already know, but I needed to write my way into and through, which is when despair gets monolithic, hope has to get into conversation. It has to get local and granular and proximate. Despair in our grand narratives of our time are based on scarcity, loss, lack, and crisis. But in our everyday worlds, we are encountering humans recognizing their common humanity, their sovereignty, their right to self-determination every day, whether you're standing in line for a coffee or you're walking across the quad or you're checking out of your hotel room. We see all of these beautiful micro instances of hope and humanity. So where do you want to spend your time? Where do you want to put your attention? Your attention is how you choose to shape your reality. So when this despair gets monolithic, and I got to tell you, I'm a hope scholar. I despair all of the time. I hide under the covers, and sometimes I even schedule hide under covers in my calendar, because I do feel the world, and if we do have hearts, and if we are alive and vivid to this moment, we are full of heartbreak and horror. We feel it in our bodies, we feel it in our relationships, we feel it in our work, in our classrooms, in the boardrooms. So we can feel all of those things, and we can also, as Anna said, do a yes and, right? Get local, get into conversation, get into your communities of practice, get rumbling, build coalitions, and find all of your weirdos and outliers. I want to end with this because I think about it all of the time. This notion of what do we do and how do we do it when we are overwhelmed by the polycrisis and wicked problems. So Lorgia Garcia Pina says, I think often about how disempowered we tend to feel when we look at the big picture, or how exhausted and defeated we might feel when we think about national or even global problems. But the possibilities can be found in the micro everyday lives that we live. Miriam Kaba, an amazing prison abolitionist and social movement builder in the US, says that hope is a discipline. It is a choice to put one foot in front of the other, to get out of bed. And maybe that's the only thing you do during a day. And sometimes during COVID, that was the only thing I could manage. And yet that is powerful. That means something that has impact. So in our possibilities, and this is the day that we are going to sort of play with, what are the possibilities in the midst of paradigm shifts? I just want to end with this, the notion that Thomas Kuhn gives us in Scientific Revolution about paradigm shift, that a dominant paradigm operates quite well like a well-oiled machine for some time. There are anomalies that pop up that machine cannot assimilate. It integrates it back in, it folds it in, but over time, the anomalies start to accumulate, they start to build up, and the dominant tools are no longer adequate to come up with these unprecedented moments, right? These crises, these fires that refuse to be put out. And so what happens in Thomas Kuhn's notion of scientific revolution is that people at the centers of power double down on the dominant paradigm and use the tools that have been long and for quite some time successful. But what happens when there are too many anomalies that start to accumulate, doubling down on the dominant paradigm precipitates the crisis. It speeds up the collapse of the paradigm and launches us into what Thomas Kuhn calls a moment of extraordinary research. This portal, this interstitial space, this threshold from a collapse of one dominant paradigm to the emergence of a new one. And in this in-between space, what happens for Thomas Kuhn, and I think what is happening right now at this very moment, is that we go back to fundamentals. We build shared vocabulary. We start to put things together that are not usually put together. There is a time of experimentation, of incubation, of throwing things at the wall to see what sticks. And it is in that creative ideation that emerges, that gives birth to the new dominant paradigm. And that new dominant paradigm will come. I think we're 2 to 5 years in Canada from what a new paradigm is. And there are a lot of architects who want to build and have a great idea of what that looks like. Privatization, job skills, credentializing, market economy. The banks are getting their little hands into our higher education. We're going to lose our institutional autonomy. And that is not okay. And, yes, and there are a ton of architects who are willing to fight for a new paradigm that centers human and ecological flourishing, that centers justice, and the justice that Cornel West talks about, which is love done in public. That's humane, that is inclusive, that is equitable, that gets us ready to build the vigorous civility we need to imagine a creative future. That's, I think, where we are. I think we've got a couple of years. I don't know how long you have in the Irish national sector. I suspect about the same amount of time. Everybody in this room is an architect, and you have tools, and those tools do not exist outside of this room. You have everything you need at this moment to build creative futures, to create intentional communities, to imagine that something different is possible. Thank you.
Thank you.